"It's just an old truck, old man," that's what Brandon said with a smirk in the cold morning air, but Henry didn't flinch. Could one call change everything in Cedar Falls? He didn't argue. Then he reached for his old phone, the number he never thought he'd need again, and he made the call. 15 minutes later, 6 black SUVs rolled into Cedar Falls, and the whole town fell silent, because some things aren't about money, some things are about respect in the memory of every mile driven, every promise kept. Welcome to Graceful Valor Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. Henry Morgan had always been a man of steady hands and patient eyes. Even at 75, the early hours of the day suited him best. Quiet roads, mist hanging low, and the world still stretching itself awake. He was behind the wheel of his old Ford F-100, a 1972 model he'd called Old Faithful. Since the day he drove it off the lot, the truck had been more than metal and wheels to him for decades. It was the canvas of his life, carrying stories etched into every dent and patch of rust. This morning, Old Faithful was loaded with wooden crates of bright red apples. The scent of sweet late-season fruit filled the cab, mixing with the faint aroma of engine oil and old leather. Henry hummed to himself a half-forgotten melody he used to sing with his wife. His hands, though gnarled and weathered, still rested lightly on the wheel like it was an old friend. He'd promised the church ladies a bushel of apples for the community pantry. It wasn't much, but it was something he could offer, something to show he hadn't forgotten the quiet ways folks took care of each other in small towns like Cedar Falls. The truck crested a hill and the valley opened wide in front of him. The white steeple of the town's church peeked out above the maple trees, a comforting sight he'd known for more than 50 years. Henry's mind drifted back, soft and tender. He remembered driving this very road with his wife in the passenger seat, her laughter filling the cab as they chased autumn colors down winding back roads. He remembered rushing her to the hospital one snowy night when her labor pains came too fast for comfort. He remembered the slow, solemn ride home from the funeral when Old Faithful had been the only thing steady enough to lean on, and he remembered Mandy's house, too. How this same truck had carried him home from the airport after Afghanistan, how it was there waiting when he stepped off the plane with the weight of loss heavy on his shoulders. In the glove box, he still kept the folded American flag they'd given him, triangular, heavy with memory, the last piece of a promise he'd made to a brother in arms who hadn't come back. The truck wasn't just his, it was theirs. Henry's breath fogged the windshield as he eased down the hill, the engine's low rumble steady and familiar. He thought about the apples in the back and the warm smiles waiting at the church. That was enough to keep his own smile gentle and real. But then the road bent, curving around a stand of maples that blocked the view of what was coming, and what was coming was fast. The Maserati was a silver flash, the roar of its engine slicing through the quiet morning. It drifted across the center line, tires spitting wet leaves, a blur of chrome and money. Behind the wheel was a young man in a tailored coat, phone pressed to his ear. He didn't see Henry, not really. Henry gripped the wheel, his heart tightening in his chest. Old Faithful shuddered as he jerked to the right, trying to avoid the inevitable, but the road was narrow, and there was nowhere to go. The impact wasn't loud, it was a dull, sickening crunch, metal on metal, glass popping and skittering across the pavement. The world shivered, the apples in the back tumbled forward, some of them rolling down the hill like marbles in the cold morning light. The truck rocked to a stop, the driver's side crumpled inward, the door hanging crooked on its hinges. Henry sat very still, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. His breath came in short, measured gasps. He felt the sting of a small cut on his forehead, warm blood trickling down to his temple. He closed his eyes for a moment, gathering himself, then he reached over and turned off the ignition. Old Faithful went silent, the kind of silence that felt almost sacred. The Maserati's door swung open with a soft, expensive click. Brandon Cross stepped out, brushing imaginary dust from the sleeve of his coat. He was 35, slick-haired and sharp-eyed, a man who had never known what it meant to worry about tomorrow. He glanced at his car, only a small dent on the fender, then at Henry's truck, crumpled and listing to one side. His expression was calm, almost bored. "Are you all right, old man?" he asked, his voice smooth as glass. "I didn't see you there. My insurance will cover the damage." Of course, Henry didn't answer right away. He opened the door slowly, the hinges squealing in protest. He stepped out, his legs steady, but his heart beating faster than it had in years. He looked at Old Faithful, at the smashed headlight and the blood-red apples strewn like confetti across the gravel. Brandon walked closer, his shoes too clean for this road. His eyes swept over the truck, a glimmer of something other than pity in their sharp depths. "This is quite a piece of history," he said, almost to himself. "You know, I collect vintage vehicles. I pay handsomely for this one crumpled fender and all." Henry turned, his brow furrowing. "It's not for sale," he said quietly, his voice even. Brandon smiled, teeth white and perfect. "Everything has a price, sir. I'll give you 10 times what it's worth, and a brand new truck to boot. Consider it a favor." Henry looked back at the truck, at the battered door that had carried him through half a century of living. He reached out and rested his hand on the warm hood, feeling the shudder of the engine's last breath in the metal. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world around them seemed to hold its breath. Waiting, then Henry reached into the pocket of his flannel jacket and pulled out an old flip phone. The plastic was worn smooth, the numbers nearly faded from years of being pressed by calloused fingers. Brandon tilted his head. "Who are you calling?" he asked, still smiling, still certain that money would fix everything. Henry flipped the phone open, his thumb steady on the keypad. He didn't look at Brandon as he pressed the familiar sequence of numbers he hadn't dialed in a very long time. "I'm calling someone who owes me a promise," he said softly. Brandon frowned. The first crack in his polished certainty. "A promise," he echoed. Henry pressed the phone to his ear, the wind lifting the edge of his coat. His eyes were calm, the color of storm clouds gathering over the mountains. The line clicked once, then again. Henry closed his eyes and let out a breath. "It's time," he said quietly into the phone. "I need your help." Then he closed the phone with a soft snap, slipping it back into his pocket. He turned back to Old Faithful, fingers tracing the dent in the door like he was touching the edge of an old wound. And in the cold, still morning of Cedar Falls, the air seemed to shift like the hush before a storm, waiting for the first drop of rain. Could this promise from the past reshape the present? Henry stood beside Old Faithful, the truck leaning to one side, the front fender crumpled inward like a folded page in a worn-out book. He ran a weathered hand along the dented door, feeling the sharp edge of torn metal. The world around him was quiet again, except for the faint drip of radiator fluid and the soft whisper of falling leaves. Brandon Cross didn't look at the apples scattered across the ground, didn't seem to care that the truck had seen better days. He was too focused on Henry, a slight smile playing at the corner of his mouth. In his mind, this was just another transaction, another old man who would see sense once the numbers got high enough. "You don't have to be stubborn," Brandon said, his voice easy and confident. "I know what this truck means to you, but I'm offering something better. Let me take it off your hands and give you something new in return." He sounded like a man used to getting what he wanted. Henry didn't answer right away. He kept his eyes on the truck, his thumb tracing the line of the old Ford logo in the chrome grille. For a moment, he let his mind drift back to another time, another life. He remembered the desert sun beating down on the convoy in Afghanistan, the weight of his body armor, and the smell of diesel and sweat. Old Faithful had been with him even then, though oceans away, rebuilt by his own hands. When he returned, every bolt and rivet a small act of defiance against the world's chaos. He saw himself behind the wheel again, racing down a dirt track to pull two wounded men from a burning Humvee. He saw the relief in their eyes, the silent gratitude, and he saw the way the old truck had waited for him back home, ready to carry the weight of memories he couldn't share with anyone else. Henry closed his eyes for a moment, letting the echoes of that day fade. When he looked back at Brandon, the younger man was still smiling, still certain that money could mend what was broken. "I'm not selling," Henry said quietly, his voice low, but unyielding. "Not for any price." Brandon's brow furrowed, the smile faltering just a little. "Come on, old man," he said, trying to keep the charm in his tone. "This is just a machine. Let me buy it and put it in my collection. You'll have a brand new truck by tomorrow." But Henry only shook his head. He didn't argue, he didn't raise his voice, he simply turned back to Old Faithful, his hand resting on the battered hood like he was steadying an old friend. Then slowly and deliberately, he opened the driver's side door and climbed back in the seat springs groaning under his weight. Brandon watched him, eyes narrowed. He didn't leave. He stood beside his sleek Maserati, arms crossed as if waiting for the old man to see reason. Inside the cab, Henry let out a long breath. The phone he tucked into his pocket still felt heavy against his ribs. He reached for it again, his fingers lingering on the cracked plastic. He could still remember the day he was given that number, the promise that came with it, a promise of brotherhood, of debts that never quite faded. He flipped the phone open, the screen flickering to life. He pressed the numbers one by one, each beep a small act of memory, and when the call connected, he spoke only a few words. "It's Henry," he said softly. "It's time." Then he snapped the phone shut, the quiet click echoing in the cab. He didn't look at Brandon, he didn't look at the apples bruised and rolling at his feet. He simply sat there waiting. The minutes stretched out, slow and deliberate. Brandon shifted from foot to foot, glancing at the Maserati, then back at Henry. He didn't understand. He thought he did, but he didn't. 15 minutes later, the sound of engines broke the stillness. It wasn't the whine of a sports car or the polite hum of a sedan. It was the low, rolling thunder of something more purposeful, something that carried weight beyond money. Black SUVs turned the corner at the end of the road, their headlights cutting through the mist. They moved in formation, not racing, but not hesitating either. Brandon straightened, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. For the first time, the vehicles rolled to a stop in a neat line, doors opening in near perfect unison. Men stepped out, dressed in dark suits that didn't quite hide the disciplined precision in their movements. Their eyes scanned the scene, calm and focused. From the front SUV, a man stepped forward. He was older than Brandon, but younger than Henry, his hair gone silver at the temples, his bearing as straight as a drawn line. He wore no uniform, but there was no mistaking the way he carried himself, like a man who had seen too much and survived it all. "Henry," he said, his voice low and respectful. "It's been a long time, Henry." pushed open the truck door and stepped down, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Alan," he said simply, "you came." "I said I would," Alan Parker replied. He glanced at the crumpled fender, the cracked windshield, the battered man standing beside the wreckage. "You held up your end of the bargain a long time ago. Now it's our turn." Brandon took a step back, his mouth opening and closing like he wanted to speak, but couldn't find the words. He looked from Henry to Alan, confusion and something like fear creeping into his polished features. "What is this?" he asked finally, his voice tight. "Who are you people?" Alan turned to him, his eyes steady. "We're the ones who don't forget," he said. "We're the ones who remember what it means to stand by your brothers even when the world moves on." Henry didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He looked at Alan, and in that look was everything: years of service, of quiet loyalty, of debts paid and promises kept. The other men moved forward, surrounding Old Faithful with the quiet precision of soldiers who knew how to protect what mattered. They didn't touch the truck. Not yet. They only stood there forming a silent honor guard around the battered relic. Brandon swallowed, his hands clenching at his sides. He'd thought this was about money, about a collector's prize, but now he saw the truth. The truck was a relic, yes, but not for sale, not for any price. Alan stepped closer to Henry, lowering his voice. "We'll take it from here," he said. "We'll make sure she's whole again, but we'll keep every scar, every mark like you asked." Henry nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "She's earned them," he said softly. Brandon turned away, his shoulders slumping. For the first time, the weight of what he tried to buy was more than he could carry, and in the hush that settled over the road, Henry felt a quiet peace. Old Faithful would be whole again, but she would never be new, because new didn't matter. What mattered was the history written into every bolt and weld, the lives touched by the man who had steered her through war and peace alike. Henry looked up at the sky, the sun breaking through the mist in pale gentle rays. He let out a slow breath, his heart steady and calm. He wasn't alone, not anymore. Could an old truck hold the key to a billionaire's lesson? Brandon took a small step forward, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel, the confidence that had carried him this far, slipping like water through his fingers. His voice, once so sure and smooth, cracked under the weight of what he didn't understand. What is this?" he asked again, though softer this time, as if he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. Alan Parker turned, his eyes cold and clear, his stance steady as a mountain. "You see an old man in a rusty truck," he said, his tone measured, every word deliberate, "but you're blind to what that really means." Brandon blinked, his brow furrowing. He looked at Henry, at the quiet dignity in the way he stood, hands resting on the scarred hood of Old Faithful. He's just a farmer," Brandon said weakly. "Why does it matter so much?" Alan's gaze didn't waver. "He's the reason 12 of my men are still breathing," he said evenly. "He's the reason I'm still here to tell you this story." Brandon's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked at the ground, then back up, confusion and something close to shame flickering in his eyes. I didn't know," he said almost to himself. Henry's fingers traced the edge of the fender, feeling the rough lines, the dents that had become a part of Old Faithful's story. He didn't speak. Not yet. There was a weight in the silence, like the hush of a church just before the first hymn. Alan took a slow breath, letting the moment hang in the cold autumn air. "We were pinned down," he said quietly. "The chopper went down and the desert turned to fire around us. Henry, he drove through that hell, pulled us out one by one. He didn't wear a uniform that day, but he was more of a soldier than any of us." Brandon's shoulders slumped, the truth settled over him like a heavy coat, the kind you can't shrug off even if you try. He looked at Henry again, but this time his gaze was different, uncertain, searching. Henry finally lifted his head, his eyes meeting Brandon's. They were the color of old iron, deep and calm, and they held a lifetime's worth of knowing. "You think this is just a truck," he said softly, "but it's more than that. It's every mile I've driven, every promise I've kept, every memory I've carried when the world got too heavy." He reached for the folded flag that Alan handed him, the fabric crisp and white against his weathered palms. It was the flag he'd kept all these years, the flag that had covered his friend's coffin, the flag that had always reminded him what he owed and what he couldn't forget. Brandon swallowed hard, his throat working. I was just trying to make it right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought maybe if I paid enough." Henry's lips twitched into something that might have been a smile, but it was small and sad, like a ghost of something long gone. "You can buy a lot of things," he said quietly, "but you can't buy 40 years of memories. You can't buy a promise kept to a man who never came home." The wind picked up, sending a swirl of red and gold leaves skittering down the road. Brandon shivered, though he didn't seem to feel the cold. "I didn't understand," he said. I thought money fixed everything." Alan let out a slow breath, his shoulders easing just a little. "Now you know," he said, "some debts can't be paid in dollars." Henry turned back to the truck, his fingers brushing over the old leather seat, the cracked dash, the worn handle of the driver's door. He could still see his wife's laughter in the passenger seat, still hear the echoes of long drives and soft conversations that had kept him company on lonely nights. The memory of that promise he'd made, words spoken in the dusty heat of a distant desert, flashed across his mind. He had told his friend he'd bring the flag home, keep it safe, and remember. And Brandon watched, silent now, his hands hanging limp at his sides. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something raw and unguarded. He looked down at his shoes, then back at the battered truck that had become something more than metal and paint in his eyes. Henry held the flag close, the weight of it grounding him in the chill morning air. He turned, his eyes meeting Brandon's one last time. "What you see is old," he said, his voice firm but kind. "I see as a testament, a reminder that we're not measured by the money in our pockets, but by the promises we keep and the lives we touch." Brandon didn't argue, he didn't offer any more deals or numbers, he just stood there, his mouth pressed into a thin line, the wind stirring his hair as he tried to take in the enormity of what he'd missed. Alan stepped forward, placing a steady hand on Henry's shoulder. "We'll take care of it," he said softly. "We'll make her whole again, but we'll leave the scars, every one of them." Henry nodded, his expression calm. "She's earned them," he said quietly, "just like the rest of us." For a long moment, no one spoke. The air seemed to hold its breath, the weight of memory and promise settling over the small group like a benediction. Then Brandon cleared his throat, his voice rough. "I'm sorry," he said, the words awkward but sincere. "I didn't understand." "I see that now." Henry looked at him, the faintest flicker of forgiveness in his eyes. "Then you've learned something worth more than any truck," he said. The wind shifted again, carrying the scent of apples and earth, the scent of things that last. Henry took one last look at Old Faithful, at the scratches and dents that had carried him through so many miles, so many years. He didn't need a new truck, he didn't need anything but the quiet dignity of knowing he'd done what he said he would. Brandon stepped back, his hands falling to his sides. He looked smaller now, humbled in a way that money couldn't mend. The truth had stripped away the shine, left only the man beneath. Henry turned back to Alan, a small, quiet smile softening the lines of his face. "Let's get her home," he said. Alan nodded, a solemn promise in his eyes. The men moved forward, their steps sure and measured, surrounding the battered truck with a reverence that said more than words ever could. Brandon stood alone as they worked, the weight of his own lessons heavy on his shoulders. He watched as Henry's history was honored, as Old Faithful was lifted gently onto the trailer, every dent and scratch, a testament to a life of quiet courage. As the convoy pulled away, the sun broke through the trees, pale and gold, the light catching on the flag in Henry's hands. And in that light, in the hush of that morning, something shifted, a reminder that some things are beyond price and always will be. The sound of the straps tightening around Old Faithful echoed softly in the morning air. The men worked carefully, each motion deliberate, as if they understood that this wasn't just a truck they were moving, it was a testament. Henry watched them, his face calm, the flag folded neatly in his hands. Alan turned to him, his expression steady. "We'll take her to the shop in town," he said. "We'll fix what's needed, but the marks, we'll leave them like you asked." Henry nodded, his fingers brushing the worn fabric of the flag. "The scars tell the story," he said softly. "Don't wipe them away." Brandon stood off to the side, silent and still. The weight of his own realization seemed to press his shoulders down, a lesson he hadn't known he needed to learn. He swallowed hard, his gaze never quite meeting Henry's eyes. When the last strap was secured, Alan gave a small nod. The trailer eased forward, the battered truck riding steady on its bed, every dent and crease catching the morning light. Henry watched as Old Faithful began her slow journey down the road, each mile taking her closer to being whole again. Though never knew, Brandon finally found his voice, the words coming out rough and low. "I didn't see it before," he said, his eyes on the ground. "I thought it was just old, just metal." He paused, gathering himself. "I'm sorry, Mr. Morgan." Truly. Henry studied him for a moment, his eyes softening with something that wasn't quite forgiveness, but something close. "Some things can't be bought, son," he said. "Now you know." Brandon nodded, the lesson written clear on his face. He turned away then, his steps slow and measured, the weight of that moment following him as he walked back to the Maserati. He didn't look back as he climbed in, the door shutting with a muted click that sounded smaller than it ever had before. Henry stood there a moment longer, the chill of the air settling deep in his bones. Then he turned to Alan, his lips curling into the faintest smile. "Thank you," he said simply. Alan placed a hand on his shoulder, firm and reassuring. "We owe you more than this," he said, "but we'll start here." With a final nod, Alan and his men loaded into the SUVs, engines purring low and steady as they pulled away. The road was quiet again, the hush of the trees and the whisper of falling leaves filling the space where the roar of engines had been. Henry stood for a moment longer, the flag still held close to his chest. Then he turned and began the slow walk back to his cabin, each step measured, each breath deep and sure. The path to his front porch was lined with golden leaves, the last remnants of autumn's fire. He paused at the door, glancing back once at the empty road before stepping inside. The cabin smelled of cedar and old books, the warmth of the wood stove wrapping around him like a familiar embrace. He set the flag down on the small table by the window, the morning light catching on the white folds. For a long moment, he just stood there, his hand resting on the table, his heart steady. Henry sat down in the old rocking chair by the window, the wood creaking softly beneath him. He looked out at the trees, the red and gold canopy rustling gently in the breeze. In that quiet moment, he let himself remember, not the noise of the crash or the sharp scent of gasoline and broken glass, but the slow miles of the road, the laughter of his wife, The steady weight of a promise kept. He didn't feel anger, he didn't feel regret, only a deep, quiet peace. In Cedar Falls, word spread quickly. By the end of the day, the story was already moving from mouth to mouth, of the old man who wouldn't sell his truck, of the men in black who came to honor him, the children who played in the town square stopped to watch the convoy leave, their eyes wide with a kind of wonder only children know. The next morning, when Henry walked to the diner for his usual cup of coffee, people paused to nod at him, not in pity, but in quiet respect. They didn't call him the old man with the apple truck anymore, they called him the keeper of memories. At the church, the ladies who'd waited for the apples took him aside, pressing his hands and saying thank you. Though he didn't think he'd done anything worth that much praise, he just smiled, the weight of his years sitting lightly on his shoulders. Back in his cabin, he sat by the window each evening, the flag always close at hand. Sometimes he traced the stitches, feeling the smooth weave of the fabric beneath his fingertips. It was a ritual that grounded him, a quiet honoring of the lives that had shaped his own. Brandon returned to the city, the Maserati a little quieter under his hands. He didn't tell anyone the whole story. How could he? Some truths are too big to fit into a boardroom, too quiet to echo down glass and steel hallways, but he carried that afternoon in his eyes, in the way he paused when he saw an old truck rumbling down a city street, in the way he looked at his own reflection and asked himself what he was really chasing. In the weeks that followed, Old Faithful came back to Henry. The truck looked much the same, dents still visible, paint still chipped in places, but the engine ran smoother, the frame reinforced by careful hands that understood that some things are worth preserving just as they are. Henry took her out on quiet roads, the kind that wound through the woods and past the rivers where the trout still rose at dusk. He didn't drive fast, he didn't need to. The hum of the engine beneath him, the smell of leaves and earth and cold air, it was enough. One night, as the first snow began to fall, Henry stood in the doorway of his cabin, the flag held close against the chill. He watched the flakes drift down, soft and silent, each one a small testament to the quiet power of time. He thought of the road behind him, the people he'd carried, and the promises he'd kept. He thought of Old Faithful, her scars a map of every mile that mattered, and he thought of how in the end it was never really about the truck, it was about the weight of memory and the gentle strength it took to carry it well. When he turned to go inside, he paused for a moment, his breath clouding in the cold, then he smiled, small and sure, and stepped back into the warmth of the cabin. And in Cedar Falls, people still talk about Henry Morgan, not because he was the richest man in town, but because he taught them that the worth of a thing isn't measured in dollars, it's measured in the stories it holds, in the hearts it binds together. In the quiet that followed, the truth settled over the little town like snow on the pines, soft, lasting, and impossibly bright. In our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way, often in the quietest places. Not everyone who helps wants recognition, some just need to know that today someone isn't going hungry, and sometimes that alone is enough to change a life. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to Graceful Valor Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.